In our segment today, we're going to have a brief discussion of the Psalms in their ancient Near Eastern context. One of the things that makes reading and interpreting, preaching, and teaching the Psalms a challenge is that they're part of an ancient culture that we don't fully understand. Many of them were written at least 3,000 years ago. And liberal and critical scholarship in the modern world has often viewed the Old Testament as just another piece of ancient Near Eastern literature. More extreme forms of that type of critical scholarship would say the Old Testament is really just a ripoff of the other ancient Near Eastern myths and legends. And I think sometimes as conservatives and evangelicals, we want to overreact to that and maybe ignore their ancient Near Eastern setting or downplay them, or think that if we see parallels between the Old Testament and other ancient Near Eastern texts, then maybe somehow we're denying the supernatural quality of the Old Testament. We can't really enter into this discussion fully, but I want to try to clear up some confusion and maybe prompt some more study by reflecting very briefly on three specific issues as we think about the Psalms as ancient Near Eastern literature. The first thing that I want to remind us of in this segment is that some of the Psalms obviously very closely parallel other ancient Near Eastern texts. And probably two of the best examples of this would be Psalm 29 and Psalm 104. Psalm 29 is the psalm that reflects on God and His power as Creator and the way that He reveals that in the thunderstorm. And that particular psalm has close parallels to Canaanite literature, and some have even suggested that this psalm originated as a hymn to Baal in Canaanite literature as the god of the storm whose voice is heard in the thunder. The seven voices or words of Yahweh in that particular psalm parallel the seven thunders of Baal in the Baal epic. But I think it's important for us to understand that the purpose of these parallels is not to rip off Canaanite literature, but rather to make an argument against Canaanite theology. The psalm is saying to us, Baal is not the king, Yahweh is. Baal is not the God who provides the storm, Yahweh is. Baal is not the God who brings the rain that you need for your crops, the Lord is. And it's making an assertion about the kingship of God. Psalm 68 verse 4 refers to Yahweh as the rider of the clouds. The same title is used of Baal, and again the point is exactly the same. Yahweh is the king, not Baal. When we look at Psalm 104, it's a psalm about the Lord as the creator of the heavens and the earth, and it's a psalm that has 7 or 8 very close parallels to an Egyptian piece of literature called the Hymn of Aten. The parallels are too close for us not to recognize that there's a correspondence. But again, the point of the literature is not that it's ripping off the Egyptians. The point is that Yahweh, not Aten, this god of the Egyptians, is the God who is to be worshipped as the creator. The sun is not God. The sun is merely one of God's creations and part of this beautiful created order that God has established and that the psalmist reflects on in Psalm 104. The purpose of the parallels in these passages, again, is not plagiarism. The purpose is polemic against the religions and the ideologies of the world around Israel. The second thing that I wanted us to see and remind us of is that the psalmists very clearly use mythical imagery in some places in the Psalms as one of their poetic devices. One of the common motifs in the ancient Near East is that a god defeats the sea or the forces of chaos or a sea monster or a sea serpent. In Babylonian literature, it's Marduk defeating Tiamat and creating the world out of that. In Canaanite literature, it's Baal who defeats Yam, the god of the sea and the forces of chaos, and establishes his kingship in that way. And one of Baal's allies in these myths is Lotan, the seven-headed sea monster. Now, when we turn to the Old Testament and we look at Psalm 74, verses 12 to 17, I think we can obviously see that the psalmist is employing this imagery. And I want to read these verses for us. But again, we have to think about what's the reason and what's the purpose for the psalmist using this type of imagery. The psalmist says, "Yet my God is king from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." And there's the equivalent to that Babylonian creature, Lotan. Here we have him described as Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open the springs and brooks. You dried up the ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, and yours also is the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth, and you have made summer and winter. Again, the purpose of all of this is not to express a mythological worldview. Psalm 74 is not giving us pagan mythology. Psalm 74 is using mythology and mythological imagery for the purpose of polemic. The Lord is the one who is king, not Baal. And so throughout the Psalms, God's control and God's submission and God's subduing of the sea are going to become very powerful images for his kingship. At creation, Yahweh subdued the sea and brought the waters under control. He put them in the place and in the boundaries where they needed to be. In history, Yahweh defeated the sea and the forces of chaos by using the waters to defeat the Egyptians and to deliver his people at the Exodus. The prophets even talk about a future time when the Lord is going to slay the sea monster and the dragon in the last days. Isaiah 27, Isaiah 51, verses 9 and 11, where he is fully and finally going to defeat the powers of evil forever and for all time. There is going to be a future time when those powers that seem to have such an influence in the world now are not going to exist. And actually, that imagery of God subduing and controlling the sea as part of his kingship carries over into the New Testament and into the ministry of Jesus. When Jesus stills the storm and calms the waves, he's making the claim that he possesses the kingship and authority of Yahweh. He's announcing to the people that God's kingship is arriving in a new way, in a new day and in a new way. And even when we see the cross, Jesus is engaging a battle with Satan and with the forces of evil, and he's ultimately overcoming them and despoiling them. And finally, in Revelation 21, when the new heavens and the new earth come, it tells us that there is not going to be a sea in those new heavens and new earth, because all of the powers of evil are finally going to be subdued. There are other ways that the Psalms and the Old Testament will take the imagery of God controlling the sea and totally diminish or wipe away the sea as having any kind of power to threaten or to rage against the Lord. The Lord created the sea, and so the sea is merely one of God's creations. He spoke it into existence with his words. The sea is not something that God needs to fight against. It's something that God simply brought into control at his creation. Job 38 images and pictures the sea as something coming forth from the womb, and God puts it in its boundaries and in its places and does not allow it to cross there, like someone putting a small child in their playpen. In the enthronement psalms, in Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, the roaring of the sea is just another one of the ways that the creation praises God and offers tribute to his greatness. Leviathan, in many places in the Old Testament, like the end of Job in Psalm 104, is just one of God's creations. And Psalm 104:26 describes Leviathan as one of the creatures that God put to play and to have fun in the sea, almost like it is God's personal rubber ducky. All of this imagery in the Psalms about God controlling the sea is not mythology. It's an assertion of God's sovereignty. And John Oswalt says that the Old Testament is not teaching us mythology, but rather it is making a self-conscious appropriation of the language of myth for historical and literary reasons, not mythical ones. The Old Testament has a worldview and an understanding of reality that is completely different from the mythological perspective of the ancient Near East. A third and a final thing that I'd like us to see is that regarding the gods of the other nations, the Psalms and the Old Testament do not deny their existence. Idols are nothing, but these gods actually do represent something. But what they will argue is that these gods are not even in the same category as the Lord. The psalmist does not teach us a polytheistic perspective, but rather their perspective is one of creational monotheism. God alone, Yahweh alone, is the eternal, self-existent, absolutely holy, absolutely perfect Creator God, and there is no one else and no other thing like Him. And so in many places in the Psalms are going to assert that the Lord is God over these other gods. They are not like Him. He rules over them. He is superior to them. Psalm 86:8 says, "Among the gods there is none like you, O Yahweh, neither are there any works like your works." Psalm 95 verse 3, "For Yahweh is a great God and a great King above all gods." Psalm 96 verse 4, "For Yahweh is great and deserving of exceedingly great praise. He is to be feared above all gods." Psalm 97:7, "All who served images were put to shame, those who boasted in mere idols. Even all of the gods bow down before Him." And so if we simply say that these gods don't exist, we're actually diminishing one of the ways that the Psalms asserts the greatness and the power and sovereignty of God. But whatever these gods are, however we describe them, whether they are gods or heavenly beings or supernatural beings or demonic powers, whatever we want to call them, they are not God, and they do not belong in the same category as the Lord of Israel. He is the unique Creator God. And I want to wrap up this segment by looking at one of the more unique psalms in all of the Psalter. Psalm 82 actually speaks of how ultimately God is going to judge these other gods for their evil, their injustice, and the things that they've done on earth to spread and promote that. Psalm 82 says this, "God has taken His place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, He is holding judgment." Notice what that verse is saying. God, the God of the Old Testament, is standing in the midst of these other gods, and He's pronouncing judgment on them. He says to them, "How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hands of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They all walk about in darkness, and all of the foundations of the earth are shaken because of the evil and injustice that these gods do." The Lord says to them, "I have said, you are gods and sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations." And so many people have tried to look at this psalm and say that these gods and these Elohim are simply earthly judges. But the use of the terms gods and sons of gods in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, and in other ancient Near Eastern literature suggests that what we are looking at here are the members of the divine council, these supernatural beings. And at some point, as God established the earth, He gave these gods or these supernatural beings, He entrusted responsibilities to them to rule over the nations, but they rebelled against Him. They followed after Satan, and as a result of that, they have become wicked, evil, corrupt. And this passage is promising that God is ultimately going to destroy evil in the world by destroying these gods as well. And these supernatural beings, these demonic forces, ultimately one day they are going to die and be destroyed like men. When we look at the ancient Near Eastern features and flavor of the Old Testament, it does not diminish the supernatural quality of the Old Testament. It enhances the beauty of its literature and its poetry. It makes even more powerful the theological assertions the Psalms make, because the Lord is speaking to a specific group of people at a specific group of time. The ancient Near Eastern qualities of the Old Testament does not strip away the authority or the inspiration of the Old Testament. Instead, what it helps us to see through its inspired and inerrant message is the greatness, the incomparability, and the reason why God alone is to be worshipped as the Lord of Lords and King of Kings.